Welcome everyone. And before we get started, for those interested, we have closed captioning available for today's webinar, and there's a link to that in the chat box here. So thanks again for joining today's webinar presentation, discussion between Doug Tallamy and Gary Tabor, and they're going to be talking about, of course, think globally, act locally. I'm Brian Fainer. I'm with the National Park Service and help support our Connected Conservation Initiative. Our Connected Conservation webinar series focuses on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to improve conservation and connectivity of natural, cultural, and recreation resources. Today's presentation is the sixth in a series focused on how individuals can help parks and nature. You can register for future webinars in the mini-series by going to the NPS Connected Conservation website, and I'll include a link there in the chat for that as well. Throughout today's presentation, if you have a question, feel free to enter it into the questions tab, and we'll take a look at everyone's questions during the Q&A. And also, as a reminder, our webinars are open to the public, so feel free to share announcements for future webinars with your friends and colleagues. So before we get started, let me introduce Doug and Gary. Gary Tabor is president of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation based in Bozeman, Montana. The center supports large-scale conservation efforts in the U.S. and abroad. Gary is also chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group, which works to combat habitat fragmentation through ecological corridors. Doug Tallamy is the Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. Among other things, one of his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His books include Bringing Nature Home and Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller. In 2021, he co-founded the Homegrown National Park Initiative with Michelle Alfandari. So with that, Doug, take it away.
All right, thanks, Brian. I'm calling this Nature's Best Hope a grassroots call to action. It's what I've been focusing on in recent years. We're really talking about the biodiversity crisis, and of course, in 2016, I think it was, E.O. Wilson wrote Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. You all know he died the day after Christmas, tremendous loss to conservation. But this was a culmination of his life's effort to save the biodiversity that he loved. He knew it wasn't optional, it was something we absolutely needed. So he wrote Half Earth, and his message was simple, was that if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save functioning ecosystems, we have to save nature on at least half of planet Earth. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't tell us a whole bunch about how we were going to save half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that sounds great. We'll just put half the Earth aside and everything will be wonderful. Problem is, half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture, and we've got just about 8 billion people in all of our airports and roadways and detritus in the other half. And unfortunately, we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering, scratching their heads, how can this actually be possible? I think it is possible, and that's what I've been focusing my work on in recent years. I think we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation to do it. The Earth is a mess. We all know that. We've got a serious biodiversity crisis being led by insect declines. They are the little things that run the world. And of course, the things that eat insects are declining as well. 3 billion fewer breeding birds in North America in just the last 50 years. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction. They said it in about 20 years, and they said it 2 years ago. So what is that? 18 years left. Nice headline, but not an option for us. So what are we going to do about it? I think there is good news here, and that is we can save our insects, we can save our birds, we can save nature itself, we can save ourselves, but we are going to need a new way, we're going to need to change the way we landscape in order to do that. And I'm talking about getting rid of the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist. This has dominated Western and Asian cultures forever. We've always had this idea that nature's happy someplace else, but we're not going to share our human-dominated spaces with it. My take these days is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. In other words, we have to find a way for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every day, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, this is where Gary and I are going to talk about different ends of the spectrum. I think we need to start on private property. We, of course, have our parks and preserves. We've got our national parks. We're in the 6th grade extinction, so they're obviously not big enough. We now need to practice conservation outside of parks and preserves, and that is on private property. In the US, that's 78% of the whole country. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So in my view, if we don't practice private property conservation on properties just like this, where we have essentially destroyed ecosystem services, we're going to fail. And that was one of the reasons that Michelle and I started the small nonprofit Homegrown National Park. It was, the idea is to motivate people to join this conservation movement and to create something where we can actually visualize our success. We're asking some simple things of everybody who can influence property, whether you own it or not. We need to reduce the area of lawn. We've got 44 million acres of lawn in the US. That's the size of New England. We've got to switch out the non-native ornamentals that we have, or at least many of them, for the very productive natives that we have. Now, not all natives are productive, so I'm focusing on what I'm calling keystone plants. We want to focus on those. We certainly want to remove the invasive species from our properties, and most of us do have invasive ornamentals on our properties. And if we have any natural areas on our properties, we certainly want to protect them as well. The product of Homegrown National Park is national awareness, not just of the problem. We hear a lot about the problems, but this is a solution. This is that grassroots solution we're talking about. We're getting millions and millions and millions of property owners motivated to just take care of their little piece of the planet. A side product of this, of course, is going to be change culture, recognizing that nature is not optional, it's essential. And everybody has a responsibility to sustaining it. Everybody has a responsibility because everybody needs it. So it's not just a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists that are in charge of taking care of the earth. It's every single person. And this map that we have developed, where you actually put your property on the map and include the area that you are being a good steward of, provides a measurable measure of conservation progress. We have this 30 by 30 save 30% of the world by 2030 initiative, 50% by 2050. Well, that's not going to happen unless we include all of the conservation that's happening on private property. So having a mapping feature that can actually coalesce all of these things is important in our view. The benefits of Homegrown National Park: convert hope to action, presents an aspirational visual. We're going to watch this map develop. It doesn't rely on governmental support, although we would love governmental support. But, again, the average homeowner without anybody's support can take action and make a difference. And it also, we're trying to merge national conservation efforts that already exist. Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, et cetera, because there's no charge for Homegrown National Park. So we're not competing with anybody else for paying membership. We just want people to register their conservation efforts, all into one visual. And if we do that, it'll reveal holes in any developing biological charters that we have that might be connecting our official park system. Lots of good things involved. And I think that's all I have. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Well, thank you, Doug. That was great. And it kind of tees up the fact that we're approaching this from different scales of action, but it all adds up. You got to work both from the small scale and the large scale. So I'm going to have Brian advance my slide. So this is my title slide. And so Brian, thanks. And I'll just say next when I want to go. So first of all, I want to talk about saving nature in a dynamic planet. We always see these snapshots of the Earth as if we're just protecting a piece of time versus a piece of time and space. A lot of the decisions we make are based on, a lot of satellite data from 2013, which is just updated now. So it's even old before we act. The world seems to be split. There seems to be a fragmentation of thinking with regards to global approaches to addressing conservation. There are folks who think about the world in terms of atmosphere, the folks in the climate change camp, because climate change is everything and we just have to work on that, and carbon emissions and sequestration. And then there are folks who work on the biosphere, the interaction of life and non-life that makes up for all life on the planet. And that's primarily the folks who work on the biosphere. And pretty much 90% of all the resources and attention go to the folks working on atmosphere, while the folks working on biosphere are really struggling, which is why we're having so much problems, as Doug alluded to, with the biodiversity crisis we're in. Next slide. We are in an epidemic of fragmentation. It just continues and continues. As Doug says, more than 50% of the planet is now human dominated. So even if we wanted to conserve half Earth, we're going to have to restore a bit of the Earth to do so. There's been unprecedented levels of fragmentation on just about every continent except Antarctica. Even during the pandemic, there's been just an epidemic of fragmentation. Next slide. That the epidemic itself is caused by fragmentation. Now, I know there's debate about the origins of the coronavirus, but it's pretty much a disease that came from flying fox species in Southeast Asia. And many of these flying fox species carry thousands of coronaviruses in their bodies, let alone the 3 that we have exhibited in terms of epidemic and pandemic proportions. So this touches us. Fragmentation is not a distant phenomenon. It touches our lives, it touches our economies, it touches our socio-political systems. Next slide. And the tip of the sphere of fragmentation is often what we call linear infrastructure: roads, rails, pipelines, canals, transmission lines. In fact, every paved road that you know now is projected to double in the next 25 years. And in Asia, where we've done studies, 2/3 of that road building will be new footprint in areas where nature is the last bastion of existence. So where people won't fight over it, where indigenous people don't have the power, that's where all this new linear infrastructure will go, continuing the trend of fragmentation. Next slide. Exacerbating the impacts of fragmentation on life, because if species cannot complete their life cycle because they don't have room to roam, to find mates, to find food, to find shelter, they certainly aren't going to have the ability to adapt to these changing climatic conditions because they'll be hit by some kind of hard edge boundary. And so climate change works in concert with fragmentation to undermine the ecological functions of nature. Next slide. And so what we're seeing, it's both the atmosphere, it's both the biosphere, it's all the impacts that we have as people. The 8 billion of us all add up. There is no independence and interdependence of action. And we are seeing, well, some say we're seeing a state shift in the Earth's biosphere. We're fundamentally changing the conditions of life for the planet, which includes our own survival. Next slide. So at the front line of conservation for the past 150 years has been the national park. America's greatest ideas. But I live about an hour outside of Yellowstone National Park in Bozeman, Montana. And as you can see, our first national park, the model that has guided so much conservation around the world, is truly just a box. And do you think ecology functions as the park is designed? No. We have to start doing conservation out of the box. Next slide. Because as these elk will show you from the Wyoming Migration Initiative, they don't stay in the box, neither do other species, neither do many of the invertebrates that Doug talked about stay in the box. You know, from the monarch butterfly to the army cutworm moth, you know, this isn't big enough to save nature, to save the functions of nature at scale. We have to think bigger, we have to do bigger. Next slide. So over the past 20 some years, ecological connectivity conservation has emerged to be the countermeasure of fragmentation. It bridges the climate and biodiversity thinking, and it really is about saving nature as it moves, whether it's species level or whether it's the flow of natural processes. The official definition is that it is the unimpeded, saving the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. And it's from streams to the marine environment with the water columns to the way we create wildlife corridors and connectivity across landscapes. Next slide. So the way to think about it is that more connection in a fragmented world is better. And in fact, why it's so important is that while protected areas, parks, and national parks are the organs of nature, the heart, the lungs, we're not doing a very good job of protecting the circulatory system of nature. And that's what connectivity conservation is all about, is saving that connective tissue that saves the interaction of species and ecology that makes for the completeness and functioning of life. Next slide. So it's simply where there's disconnection or fragmentation, we just want to protect those connections. Often it's in terms of corridors or linkage zones. And where there is fragmentation, maybe it's a road, we want to mitigate those impacts. We have to applaud the new Infrastructure Act for adding $350 million to support wildlife crossing structures across our nation. Because as we build infrastructure, we have to be smart about it. And in the end, on the right of this slide, what we're trying to do is a vision for ecological networks. Where we have nature, we have to connect nature. We have to connect it more and better. And where we have to counteract the fragmentation process, we have to create these networks of nature. Next slide. So this is my final slide. So what happens here is that parks and protected areas are the front line, but conservation happens on all lands and seas across all scales. And this is just 130 of the 450 large landscape efforts that are part of the North American Network for Landscape Conservation. And as you can see, there is a growing movement of conservation practice that takes this connectivity principle and adds it all up at scale to work at large landscapes to save nature in cooperative ways across various communities, from tribes, government, and non-government, to the private sector, to community groups, that we all have to work together to save nature at scale. This is a budding movement that is occurring without much governmental support. It's because we have to work at this scale to address these problems that are happening at global scale. And because of climate change, because of all the fragmentation, this is an all hands on deck moment. and it requires big ideas and big visionary projects to essentially help us save nature at the scale it functions. So thank you all, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks Gary and Doug. Let's turn that off. Okay. So there you have it, folks. Two really important approaches to thinking about conservation, two windows into that world. I've got a couple general questions, many of which came from our Park Service Connected Conservation team to kind of help guide our conversation. But again, for everyone listening in, if you have a question, just type it into the questions tab, and we'll take a look at it. So, Doug, this is going to be a similar question for you too, Gary. But for Doug, your book, Nature's Best Hope. I think I'm on my 4th copy because I keep giving it away. What has brought you to this point? I mean, in a lot of different respects, I kind of see it as like another kind of Aldo Leopold type, vision for looking at your yard and your land. What got you to this point in your research and your thinking?
Oh, that's a long story, but really, I mean, I'm an entomologist and I studied insect behavior for the first 25 years of my career. But in 2000, my wife and I moved into a new property, a farm that had been broken up into 10-acre lots. It had been mowed for hay and then taken out of mowing 3 years before we moved in, thoroughly invaded with non-native plants. So it was the experience of moving into this totally wrecked ecosystem and our effort to put it back together again. And we saw how easy it was to do and how successful it's been that has brought me here. I started writing about it. People started asking, oh, gee, what can we read? What can we read? And that's why I wrote the books. But our research has shown that you can document the quality of your local food web just by counting the moth species that are involved, because caterpillars are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So 5 years ago, I started counting the number of moth species on our house, taking a picture of them. If I don't get a picture, it doesn't count. I'm up to 1,195 species, and now making a living on our 10 acres that was, it was ripped when we moved in. So it works. I mean, and that's really motivating. I think you mentioned Aldo Leopold. He did the same thing. He put the Sand County property back, and he said, geez, this works. He called that a land ethic. We can do this even on totally destroyed. If I read another book, it might be about nature's resiliency, about how it really will respond. We can't wait till everything's extinct. But even things that seem locally extinct somehow find it and they really come back. It's very encouraging, and that's been my primary motivator.
That's great. That's really fun to hear that you lived it, and through that experience, here's the book because I did. It works. That's exciting. That's really cool. So similar question for you, Gary. With the center, you guys are hosting and supporting such important initiatives, Animal Road Crossing, the Network for Landscape Conservation, and I kind of see you as like a conservation godfather in a way. What brought you to this point? I mean, and being a real thought leader on landscape conservation. I mean, that term really wasn't much of a term 20 years ago, and it seems like that is like a big, serious focus now. What has driven your path here? Oh, you're muted. All right, try. Here, let me try unmuting you, Gary. All right, now it says you're self-muted. Try to do it yourself here. All right.
Okay, that was the most wise statement I've ever made, and I'm so grateful you all heard it. What was the next question? No. So let me begin with my childhood, like so many people who were inspired at an early age to do this kind of thing. First of all, I grew up spending all my formative years in the Adirondack Mountains, Adirondack Park, the largest state park in the contiguous United States. And it really had a fundamental impact. It still does. I go there every summer, since I was a 9-year-old boy. It inspired Bob Marshall. I think that landscape says a lot about what you can do. Yes, there are problems working with people, and that also came to light, is that big conservation can also have big issues working with local communities. As I grew, into this field of conservation, my mom was a real estate agent, so maybe I'm making amends for her, but she wasn't a developer. But what was interesting about my mom as one of the first real estate brokers in the state of Maryland was that she looked at houses as homes, as people. We knew neighborhoods by the names of the people. This is where the Mackenzies lived. That's where the Johnsons lived. Those are where the Friedmans lived, and we knew how they were connected. And I guess for me, this large-scale conservation is about connecting people to connect nature. And I always felt, from the lessons of big nature being the Adirondacks, but also the fact that people are part of the solution, not the problem, that I always felt that, conserving nature is a community conversation. And I really felt that a lot of this large-scale work isn't about here's a big vision and let's hope people buy in. It's more like a lot of the stuff that Doug does with working with one neighbor at a time, and it creates a community, and that community creates a larger urban area, if you will. It grows and grows to the point where you have a collective action going on. And I feel that this is where conservation has to go to achieve scale and to deal with those invasives that everyone's fighting on their individual lawns, but they can't fight alone, and they have to have some kind of collective community action to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the title, this webinar and bringing you together is, think globally, act locally. For me anyway, you hear that. I've been hearing it for decades. And it just seems like conservation's got a lot more sophisticated, but maybe it's just that we've been doing it for longer. Is that mantra working as a communication strategy? And I guess a part of that similar question, this is for both of you. How can local conservation efforts potentially benefit from thinking globally? And then at the same time, how can global conservation efforts benefit potentially from thinking locally? Is it an either or? Is it both? What are your thoughts? You guys have heard that for a long time as well. What are your thoughts with that? Doug, you want to take it on first?
I go for the it's both category. I am so glad Gary's doing what he's doing, because I know what I'm doing. It's an important part of the picture, but it's not enough. We need the big connectivity. Of course, if everybody really responded, even if everybody responded on their yards, we still have the major interruptions, all of the roadways and all these things. It's going to take resources beyond the individual to provide that connectivity. One thing I didn't tell you is when you make all those caterpillars at home, we got 60 species of birds that are breeding there because there's so much food. And if everybody put all the plants back, the reason it's happening is we put the plants back, we would make great inroads. But again, it's not going to help the grizzly bear. It's not going to help the elk, and it's not going to help what the World Wildlife Fund talks about: wildlife disappearing. We lost 3/4 of our wildlife in the last 50 years, whatever. I talk about the little guys, and they're the basis of the food web, but we need to help the big guys as well, because we need all of them. And that's why I'm so glad Gary's here. So I say both at the same time: act globally and act locally.
Well, I couldn't agree with Doug more. I think sometimes, so here's what I found about working with landscape groups is that they all have one thing in common. They don't talk to each other. And I don't know at what level that is, whether it's parochial or at a community level or landscape level or regional, but there's something about communication. So this work, just like good family relations, good community relations, it's all about communication. This is all about communication. Often we find that smaller efforts, or what we call more parochial efforts, benefit by having larger scale visions. They know where they fit in. They see where their actions are making a difference. So it really is the acting locally, doing something globally, is when you show folks that, yes, your bit makes a difference. And here are the other folks who are doing this, and they're not just working in isolation, but you're talking to each other, or you're identifying what each you're doing. That's when things start to really connect. That's when those words have true meaning. And so my job and folks like Doug, we're always there trying to make that connectivity of conversation happen so that these different actors know that it does all add up. It does all that up, and it does make a difference.
If I can interject here, the big disconnect, in my view, is between the science and the policymakers. I got an email today about a developer group in Maryland that is trying to rewrite their forest protection rules. They want to be able to take half of every forest for houses. And they're well on their way to succeeding because they have a big voice, and the policymakers, that don't get it, that this is just not an option. And there's just a few guys doing that. This is where it breaks down. And of course, once the houses are there, the big forest is gone. So we've got to improve that connectivity, where the people making ecological policy have to have some ecological know-how.
That's correct. And one of the challenges we have with the 30 by 30 conversation is that we want more blobs. I call them blobs, these big, spatial areas, but we have a measles problem. If we don't connect those blobs, we're not creating more effective protected areas. And which is why we have to have policy that supports connectivity at the state and federal, maybe municipal level as well, that says that there's a connectivity value between these areas of nature. If we don't identify that, that's where the roads go in. That's where the transmission lines go. That's where all the fragmenting forces will concentrate. So you have to educate people who are making decisions about land use that there's connectivity value out there. These landscapes or seascapes may not be worthy of full protection, but they do have conservation value, and you need to recognize that conservation value even as you take development action. And often people think, well, here's where conservation happens, and here's where conservation doesn't have to happen. And that's a wrong way to approach this.
Do you feel like there's, Gary, I guess for some of the large landscape stuff, a disconnect though between when you're looking at campaign strategies to conserve a big landscape, a disconnect with you can work with the big players on a landscape, but what about everyone else, the general public? Because it seems like, again, even you get some of the decision makers, you can influence them, but it seems like if, like Douglas pointed out, if the public isn't educated as well, they're not going to be be informed of the significance of a landscape or how unique it is to have certain wildlife, biodiversity, whatever. If they're not educated, then they're not going to be talking to their friends and colleagues and leaders, decision makers either. So is there a disconnect with the role of individuals in these broader campaigns?
Well, there are always headwinds with projects like this. I mean, the headwinds being there are people who don't want conservation, that see this as big land grab. They want to define your approach, even if your approach is not that approach. They want to define it in terms that undermine these kind of efforts, and that's one aspect, which is why and true community engagement is so vital. so much of conservation has failed because they've come out with maps before talking to people, and often that's, you know, to their detriment. But I see something changing here in this nation and in other parts of the world. You know, no one questions the Appalachian Trail being, you know, 2,000 miles long and the landscape around it needs to be protected. That's a large landscape. You know, Governor DeSantis, who is very conservative in Florida, is doing a lot for the Florida Wildlife Corridor Project. We see this as a bipartisan issue, that people see that the backbone of nature is the backbone of so many cultures, whether they're First Nations, Native Americans, or the rural traditions. So much of nature is part of our societies that we are now undermining the fabric of those cultures, and people are taking notice. So it is about conservation, it is about nature, but so much of this conversation is moving about saving, you know, who we are as a nation, a people, our community.
Yeah, I've been talking about this for you know, more than 15 years now, and I've seen the needle move. I think what has moved the needle faster than anything are the big papers carrying headlines. We've got, you know, we've got the insect apocalypse. We've lost 3 billion birds. We're going to lose 1 million species. I didn't think anybody would care, but they do care. They're all upset. I get emails immediately. What? You know, and you know why they care? Because they like nature. They still do not fully appreciate how much they need it. You know, we still need a little education about what a functioning ecosystem is, about the loss of ecosystem services. You know, how do you know you're over the carrying capacity? Well, as soon as you're using resources faster than they're generated, and that has been for a long time now. So we need to educate along those lines, but people like nature. They don't want everything to go extinct. And we need to take advantage of that momentum, which is building, like Gary said.
And nothing like the pandemic to get people, you know, going into nature. I mean, it was solace for so many, and their national parks really were there to be a resilient rescue for our country during that period.
Yeah, well, for Doug, I mean, your homegrown national park initiative, where people can put their land on this map, you know, for what they've done and contributed. It seems like the timing of that with the pandemic, of course, was ideal. How much of a role do you think the pandemic has played with people, you know, in their backyards, and where do you think that effort is kind of heading?
Well, the idea preceded the pandemic by about 12 years, but whether or not people are joining homegrown, you know, maybe it has. We've got two groups of people. We've got the choir, the people who have always loved nature. They've always tried to help as much as they can, and I'm saying, here's something you can do. Great. The real goal of Homegrown National Park is to reach the non-choir, the millions of people who don't have a clue that they are a vital part of the future of conservation. That's why we're using the social media. And so, yes, I think the pandemic brought some more people into the, you know, the choir mold, but we still have an awful lot of people who just do not know. This has not been part of our educational system. It's much better than it was when I went to school, where the word ecology hadn't been invented yet, and you know, there was none of it. But the issue that nature is not optional is so important that we absolutely need it. And this is what E.O. Wilson was saying with half Earth. You know, if you destroy it on half the earth, you're going to lose it everywhere. So that's the message we have to work on.
Gary, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, kind of this east versus west thing in conservation. You know, people, it's not just conservation, but people live in the West who say, oh, you folks in the East, you city folks, you don't understand the West. And I'm wondering, you know, and through the lens of conservation, is it also true potentially that, you know, that folks in the West don't understand the challenges for conservation in the East? You know, 4% of federal land. of the federal lands that the government, we all own, 4% of it, only 4% of it is east of the Mississippi River. So I looked it up, right? Doug, in Delaware, you've got 2% federal lands. Gary in Montana, you got 29%. So when you're collaborating and you're thinking about, from our lens, with a national park, you're likely surrounded by BLM or Forest Service, and you're working with a smaller number of stakeholders. But then in the East, it's really overwhelming, right? It's a different starting point of scales. I mean, for a park, you're surrounded by, in all likelihood, all private land. So you're starting at a different scale with a different set of challenges. What do we do about that? Because it's hard. I mean, it's really. I know, Gary, you guys are supporting more the lands, the Appalachian Trail landscape partnership, and thinking about that. But what are some thoughts on that? I guess Gary and then Doug on this kind of that. It's a different, not a game board, but it's a different setting for how you approach these different challenges.
Well, we all share one thing, East and West. We're seeing more extreme weather events, bigger floods, bigger droughts, bigger fires, record temperatures. I mean, it's, and our lands are resilient. Our lands and waters are our resilience to these kind of new changes we're facing. And so conservation has to take a greater priority to give us more resilience to these kind of big changes, because water is the national conversation, water and fire. And in order to save water and fire, we have to think, in terms of these large scale conservation approaches. And I see that, everyone says this is a Western issue. No, I see with climate change, this is a big issue. That's why I think the Florida Wildlife Corridor Project is gaining momentum to save so much of the high ground of Florida, which is critical for a very low state elevationally. And then also with the Appalachian landscape, I mean, the idea is thinking of a climate corridor for the next 100 years, because 120 million people depend on the watersheds that come from this landscape. And this landscape, the Appalachian landscape, is a populated landscape. The only, dark sky areas are the Adirondacks, because I include the Adirondacks in the Appalachian landscape, and northern Maine. So really, it is a populated landscape where people, both rural, some of the most rural parts of the eastern United States, with some of the most urban parts of our nation, come together and are tied together by that landscape. So I think the large scale concept is now a national discussion. Yes, it may be applied differently because there are different land tenures and different actors, and maybe the government has a bigger role in the West, but I see private forests just having an equally big role in the Southeast, because that's where the most of the water is, most of the carbon is, and most of our nation's biodiversity is in the Southeast. So it's different actors with different holdings, but I think everyone's is now coming to the conclusion that they all have a role to play in this kind of new climate changing world.
I'll just briefly add, of course, conservation issues are not the only place that East and West differ in terms of views. And part of the issue is that if you drive across Nevada, it is a hard sell to say, look, we've taken it all. Because they look around and well, no, of course, they're not thinking there's a cow on every single one of those acres out there. But in the East, it is much easier to convince people that we've taken it all, because you spend half your day sitting in a traffic jam, not going anywhere. So the conversation is different. Of course, in the East, we have been separated from nature a lot longer. The disconnect is bigger. People in Manhattan don't think they need nature. They've never had it, and they're just fine. They don't realize the resources that keep them alive are coming from functional ecosystems someplace else. But so it is a different conversation because of the population structure of the entire country.
Yeah, when you think of Manhattan and they think Great Mohegan, they're thinking of a casino when it's really the name of the great River Hudson that defined the landscape.
So it seems like, again, in the East, when you've got so many more private lands, you're kind of starting in neighbors. I'm just thinking outside, you pick a little protected area anywhere in the East and you look around it, you're gonna have a bunch of neighbors, maybe if you're lucky, some state lands, a logging timber company, to work with that owns possibly a lot of land. But it seems like you have to start smaller. Is that true? Or I guess AT is a different thing with the AT landscape, but it seems like are there, in what instances do you need to start small versus big and vice versa?
Well, it's easy to start with what exists, first of all. So in the East, that's tiny little patches. If you're looking for connectivity possibilities, look at the river and stream systems in the US, map it out. It is there. Everything is connected except for a few small areas in Texas where they don't have any. If you did riparian restoration and connectivity along every one of those waterways. Of course, that's also where we build our big cities because it was easy to transport goods. I don't know, Brian, I forgot the question, but
It's fine.
Well, I mean, let me answer. Let me add to Doug's riff in the sense that I'm a big fan of land trusts, and with the land trust movement especially New England started with small, but they've grown. And yes, a lot of people say we have too many land trusts in New England, but in reality, I think the land trust movement is a great example of where you can work at a scale that's manageable with small, but now they realize if you go to these land trust rallies, there's connections being made between these entities. They're starting to think in landscape ways. They're looking at connectivity. They're trying to be additive with their resources. So I really feel that we do have some institutional hope with land trusts as one example of how do you take this small scale work that began in the East and really applying it across the nation.
Yeah. That's great. How about the role of individuals and communities with general conservation, and again thinking about local and global? What are the different roles that you guys see that are maybe underutilized and need to be encouraged for individuals, communities, and then even the federal, state, and federal governments? What's working, and what needs to happen? Where is there a need for improvement?
Well, again, I haven't focused on.
Can I go, Doug?
Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
Oh, well, the work I do, the rate limiter for conservation is not having coordinators. So many of these efforts, so many people are focused on in their one institution, their one community. We don't have people who can coordinate all the various actors. And a lot of folks think, well, that's too much process. Well, that process makes for effective product. And we need more coordination support. That's writ large across the nation. If we want to work at these different scales with these different actors, with communication improved to get effective conservation, we really need support for this coordination capacity. It's a rate limiter.
Yeah, well, it's what we started out with. We need it at both ends. We need coordination at the top. I think the ease with which the individual can see effective conservation happen. They plant a milkweed plant and the monarch comes and they see it and they get so excited. Then they want to plant another one. Then they want their neighbor to. Then they go to the Central Park and do it again. These are hooks that really get people involved at the lowest level. So we need to build at both levels.
So what is the role of the federal government in all of this? in terms of supporting these local, supporting individuals who want to do some good on their property, be good stewards. Again, with thinking about communities, how can the federal government help communities do great stuff for conservation? What is working, and what are some of the opportunities that aren't yet being acted upon?
Let me just say a few words, Gary, and then I'll turn it over to you because you've got some real things to say here. If we change the tax structure in a way that affected everybody, you get tax breaks for good conservation effort on your land, we could turn it around overnight. And there are models of this. Costa Rica did that. So that is something that would affect the individual. We could probably, people say, where's the money going to come from? We could stop suing people for the Endangered Species Act and save a lot of money that way. But, the infrastructure bill, look what that can do, Gary. That's a big government effort. So take over.
Well, TPL showed that, if you have all these, people will tax themselves with these bond measures, open space measures, community after community, somewhere in the 90-some% of success, that communities will tax themselves to support conservation at the community level. So the people do act if given the opportunity to. I will say this about the federal government. They have great programs, but they're all disconnected. There is no clearinghouse for getting those resources to the ground. And so, again, coordination. It's a Rosetta Stone right now. Only those players who really know the Farm Bill will get Farm Bill resources. Only those players who really know how to work with the Department of Interior will get those kind of resources. That shouldn't be the way. We need a more connective, coordinated approach to get all the billions that we hear. I mean, there's a lot of money on the table that's not getting to the ground, and that has to be fixed. I want to say one last thing about the National Park Service. In my slideshow, I showed a box, and we have to get outside the box. The National Park Service, to all my colleagues and friends who work for the National Park Service, I hope I'm not sounding too critical, but I really feel that our Park Service has to be, if you are the center of conservation, you have to come out of the center to be with the folks who are to support you in a broader landscape. That's why, like, the Biosphere Reserve networks are so important. We have to get the Park Service's mindset to get out of the park itself and work with those communities around the park. And I think the parks have a big role, big social, ecological role to play in this conversation. Maybe that's part of the coordination support.
Well, remember why the Park Service was established. It's because they were gorgeous places that needed to be preserved so future generations could enjoy them. It was not about conserving ecosystem function or biodiversity. So, that was 100 years ago. All right, we've come a long way. But we got to move beyond the entertainment value of park services into the functional value. And that means they've got to be bigger, or at least their reach has to be bigger.
So I'm trying to think of how many, usually we have over 300 million visitors a year or something outrageous, and the crowding is continuing. And
375 million last year.
Thank you. So,
I mean,
right?
Glacier
There's a
National
lot of
Park,
people. What's that, Gary?
Well, Glacier National Park, where I live in Montana, was never supposed to. I used to be like, I was Montana Conservation Corps when I was in college. It was called Youth Conservation Corps then. It was never designed to have 3.5 million people visiting over the summer. Going to the Sun Road is just not, we have to do something different. We are at a breaking point. People are loving nature, but the Park Service has to see, hey, we have a new model here and new challenges, and we have to step up for conservation in the 21st century.
It's a lot of open ears, right? For people who come to parks, and they look at the night sky, they see the monarch butterflies, right? And part of what we're trying to do, of course, is trying to encourage not only interpret and explain how cool those resources are, but again, what people can do at home, like what we have on our Conservation at Home page on our Connected Conservation website. And again, like for Doug, your whole, the Homegrown National Park and what your book is all about, right? I mean, what percentage of people, if they turn some of their grass into a park, what would that look like again? What's the potential for that?
Well, if we cut the area of lawn in half, that's 20 million acres right there.
Yeah,
And lawn is one of the issues. It's a low-hanging fruit, but it's a good place to start. And it's so easy. Plant some trees, put some beds under them. You're done. Plant the right trees.
20 million acres, that's 10 Yellowstone National Parks.
That's right. That's right.
So this is a good segue into the other webinars we have planned in our webinar series. On November 10, we've got Brooke Tolley and Sarah Molina with the Park Service talking about how to motivate individuals to take conservation action. And then on December 7, we're going to be focusing on how these collective individual actions can lead to really big things. And we're going to have Brandon Shaver with RARE, the organization RARE, and then Adam Snyder and Andrew Tuck with the Nature Conservancy, who work on some of these state bond issues and incorporate individual action strategies into those campaigns. So thank you, Gary and Doug. I mean, this is just really inspiring and a lot to chew on and to digest. This is a great conversation, and we really appreciate your time and all you do. Of course, I mean, you guys are doing important work, getting the word out like you do, Doug, with Nature's Best Hope, and Gary for all those the networking and supporting that you do for those important projects, networks that you all host at the center. So thank you for all of that.
It was wonderful meeting you, Gary, too, finally.
Yeah, and thank you, Doug. I just want to let you know that I'm in my kitchen. This is a kitchen table conversation. And so this is truly a homegrown conservation conversation. So thank you all.
And I'm looking forward to the book that you guys haven't yet written about global and local, and really, again, rethinking this think globally, acting locally, because yeah, it needs to be both. Things aren't getting better; they're continuing to be more and more challenges. So the two approaches are more important than ever. So thank you for doing what you're doing,
Right.
and thanks everyone. Go ahead, Doug.
I have to run. I got my class, so
You got your class. All right, take care.
I hear the bell.
And Gary's got something in the oven. He's cooking there. So, all right, take care, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.